but you don't have.
Start recording now. So we missed. Okay. Okay, first I'd like to invite Rabbi Mike if he wants to say a few words to start us off. Rabbi?
Yes. Well, there's a really interesting part of the Torah portion that is coming up, and those of you who came to Apple and Bourbon on Sunday, you heard about this selection of upcoming Parsha, in which Moses has a brother and a sister named Aaron and Miriam, and they seem to be upset that Moses gets a little bit more of the credit than they do, or a little bit more attention than they do. He is a prophet. They are prophets as well, but of course he's Moses, so he's got a little bit more prophecy than even the brother and the sister. But that's not the first thing they say. The first thing that they say when they speak is, Miriam and Aaron spoke against the Cushite woman who Moses married, saying he married a Cushite woman. If you know, is an ancient and sometimes current name for the land that's around Ethiopia. So in some, whether it's Zipporah or another wife, it's not clear. Moses has married an African woman, and the insecurity that Moses, brother and sister Miriam and Aaron have, it's hard to talk. So they kind of go for the first thing, right? The first thing that you can comment on is what you see, and they thought that Moses, look, you married. Guess who's coming to Rosh Hashanah? And it's really, to me, it's how racial prejudice and a racial caste system or other types of bias sometimes mask underlying insecurities and anxieties, right? That Miriam and Aaron are really upset about their station in life, but the thing that's easiest to pick on is ethnicity and race. Unfortunately, tragically, this continues to move through history until you get to the United States, in which you have vast tracts of cities that are separated by race. And people will sometimes say, oh, we're worried about the schools, we're worried about safety. But the easiest thing to pick on is what you can see. And in this particular country, it plays into all sorts of horrible experiences, a history of a racial caste system in which labor was stolen and people humanized. And so I think it's only fitting that this week, when we celebrate, I should say we remember the yahrzeit of Floyd, who was also his life taken because of where he was and who he was at what time it was happening. That we start to break down this idea that it's only natural that different groups of people are separated into different parts of a town or different parts of a city or parts of a country, and say that that's not an inevitable thing, right? It's not inevitable that Miriam and Aaron are going to make that complaint to Moses' wife. Inevitable we have segregation and discrimination in housing. That's a choice that human beings make, and we can also choose to unmake it. And so it's really amazing to work with and to also have our local expert, Bob Van Meter, with us, who fighting this fight forever. And hopefully we can start getting some wins, Bob. And maybe we start here, God willing. This on a night where you could be relaxing. It's really encouraging to see so many people here. And thanks, of course, to Nasa and Sarah for making it. Racial justice team led by Sue and Diane.
Okay, I guess I will project my PowerPoint. get started, I want to apologize in advance because the weather is not great here. I'm in the western part of the state, and it's definitely raining pretty hard. So there'll be some thunder in the background. So let me just pull up my slide briefly. Okay, great. See the slide. Perfect. So I'm so excited to be here tonight to talk to you about housing discrimination. As Sarah mentioned, this is part one, 2 parties. So I will be back again on Tuesday with part 2, talking a little bit more about organizing and housing discrimination today. But just to begin with a little bit about JALSA, I know we're so lucky joined by our director, Cindy. We do a lot of legislative advocacy, working with legislative coalitions. We also do community outreach with congregations like your own to promote progressive policy throughout the Commonwealth. So we're so fortunate to be able to work with you all. Really look forward to this discussion tonight. Also, I just want to thank, of course, Bob Van Meter for all of his expertise and on this presentation. So to begin, I just love to hear a little bit more about you all. So we're going to discuss. So my pronouns are she, her, hers. So please share if you feel comfortable. And I just love to hear maybe just briefly what you all here tonight. And it's fine if we just want to popcorn answers.
Can start. I'm Laurie Burnett, she, her, hers. I learned about this through the Acton Boxborough Social Justice Collaborative, part of the Neshoba Area Social Justice Collaborative. I've also done some work in housing and in education. I'm excited here because we're interested in sort of working with our town government around this work and potentially local realtors.
Wonderful. Anyone else want to share? Franny, I see your microphone is on.
I'm Franny Osman, active. I've been involved with the For All group with Bob Van Meter since it began in 2018. And I chair transportation as my internet connection is unstable, so tell me if you have trouble hearing me. The Mission on Disabilities and the Transportation Committee. Also, we're having a special election soon.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Maybe one person wants to share here tonight. Well, we can keep going with the presentation. Today we're going to be covering material that can often challenge. It's important that we can come together to create a space that's supportive, non-judgmental, and open, and where we all comfortable asking questions, sharing our. So I'd love to just start with a few group agreements. Number 1, so discussing good faith, assuming good intentions, values, collective commitment to justice. Number 2, meet each other where we are. We are all coming from different places with varying levels of comfort and confidence regarding conversation. So welcoming all levels of knowledge and being supportive of learning. And then finally, just open to comfort. Because possible conversations might make us feel some degree of discomfort, and being willing to explore that and talk about it together, or become defensive. So I like to keep those things in mind. I think those are really helpful agreements. So we're talking a little tonight. I'm going to start just talking a little bit about structural racism before moving on to racial opportunity. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the history of housing discrimination. So that's our plan for part 1. Okay. So this is interactive. So to begin, I have another question for you. So when I say racism, I'd love to know, think of, based on now, how would you define it? And also what thoughts, images, and stories come to mind when you hear that word. Again, opening a say, feel free, to just to turn your microphone on and answer this question.
You might have to pick on people.
Okay. You judge cold calling tonight or put anyone on the spot. So we can continue to the next slide. But there will be more space for some discussion later. So
I mean,
Okay.
if I could say there's racism in between two different kinds of people, and there's also racism that like shows up in the criminal justice system and in housing and employment, who are more likely to get hired and get a loan and not arrested for a small traffic infraction because being brown or black.
What I think of is when I hear the word, I think of discrimination. I think people have preconceived notions and feelings of superiority based on other to a group that they are in, but just defining them as a group rather than as an individual. That's what just first comes to mind.
Thank you so much. That's a transition. And that leads me to my next slide, because I think that's an important distinction that you touched on. So this personal racism, and then of course looking at more structural forms of racism today. And I think that's important piece of the conversation. We are talking about house discrimination. So I know a lot of you are probably familiar with this material, so I'll try to move through this, really quickly, just so we're on the same page. So interpersonal racism, as you both were saying, really refers to prejudices and discriminatory behaviors where one group makes abilities and intents of other groups based on race. And this set of prejudices leads to cruel, intentional, or unintentional action towards others. And we internalized racism. And, in a society in which, really all aspects of identity and experience are, one group is politically, socially, and economically dominant, members of the stigmatized groups who are bombarded with negative messages about internalize those negative messages. And then alternatively, there are, those bigoted beliefs that, or implicit bias as well. That's also related to internal racism. Okay, now this comment, which is really important tonight when we are talking about housing discrimination and this de jure racism is enforced by the federal government, talking about institutional racism. And again, this is something that we touched on here. Assumptions are structured into the social and economic institutions in our society. So institutional racism occurs in organizations, businesses, or institutions, of course, like schools and police departments, discriminate either deliberately or indirectly against people. Of racism reflects the cultural assumptions of the dominant group. And then, in addition to that, slightly more structural racism, which refers to just the accumulation over centuries of the effects of a racialized society. And the example that that's really relevant to our conversation tonight, when we talk about structural racism, is the creation of a white middle class, what it means today, been left that process of wealth creation, home ownership, college education. We can think of so many more examples. And that all fits, this umbrella of structural racism, which is something, I really want to explore a little bit more tonight. And we're going to talk about more in depth. Okay. So what does this mean, for our conversation? Actually, one. Okay. So I have a quote here that I pulled from Grassroots Policy Project, and I'd love if someone in the audience could read it. Do we have any volunteers? I'd love to hear some new voices.
Okay, I'll volunteer.
Okay, fantastic.
Okay, the critical aspect of racism we must address is the accumulation and incorporation of longstanding racialized practices into all our social and economic structures or structural racism. If race no longer matters, how do we explain the persistent disparities among groups and disproportionate levels of poverty, incarceration, unemployment, etc., in communities of color? We can't, not without a structural racism analysis.
Thank you so much, Carol. So that was fantastic. So this is why we're here tonight. We're here to explore those disparities, how they today in housing discrimination, and in part two, what we as a community can do about this. So just the key takeaways from the conversation about structural racism that I'd love to pull away to pull from this as we're moving forward in this conversation. So one, that it's possible for an action, policy, or decision to be racist without someone feeling or thinking racist thoughts. And in our work together, that's why we focus primarily on the racial impact. So that's how different measures create racial disparities rather than the intent. That's part one. And then part two, benefiting from white privilege does not mean one's life has been easy. So to just really kind of, specify our terms, it means that one's life has not been difficult because of one's race, and that one has not had to deal with the unique barriers created by racial disparities. I think, especially, talking about housing, people can get really defensive. And I think, that's, at least I find a really helpful piece of the conversation. And then three, that there's also, immense reason for hope. And I think whenever we're talking about structural racism or institutional racism, we're talking about, systems that we inherited, social structures and institutions that serve as the primary driver behind these racial disparities. But I think, the inverse of that means that we should also feel empowered as a community to create our own structures and systems, and that we can create better ones. And so for me, that fills me with hope. And, I just by coming together tonight and having these conversations, I think, we're already, taking a step forward with that. Okay. So this map here that you see is from the it displays the spatial pattern of distribution of opportunity based on economic, education, mobility, and housing and neighborhood. A really kind of comprehensive study. And I wanted to share with you, some key takeaways from this study here. I think it's interesting. And you see that the dark red represents all the high opportunity areas that were determined by these, these, and the lighter areas, so lower opportunities. And I think some really interesting takeaways from the study that they found is that racialized isolation neighborhood opportunity is very evident in Massachusetts. The degree of racial isolation in low opportunity areas in the Commonwealth is one of the highest rates of opportunity segregation found in the Kirwan Institute's mapping analysis all over. And then substantial racial segregation can be found in Commonwealth opportunity communities for African Americans and Latinos, which I think, is evident looking at this map. And then, number two, I think is interesting, that racial isolation into low opportunity neighborhoods is far more pronounced, they found, than class-based segregation into these opportunity communities. So the findings suggested that while both race and class play a role in who had access to high opportunity communities, that race have played a stronger role than class in heightening isolation into low opportunity neighborhoods in Massachusetts. So to me, that's really quite striking. And it's also important to remember that, by some measures, Boston has been calculated to be the 13th most segregated region in Massachusetts. And segregation impacts all of us, but as you can see by looking at this opportunity map, that it especially harms African-American communities who disproportionately least neighborhood, right? These low opportunity neighborhoods. So unfortunately, where we live plays a primary role in determining our access to living, transportation, green space, exposures to dangerous particulate matter, and even our health life expectancy. As you can see today, the pandemic, access to quality healthcare. So this map determines our opportunities, and not only do we live separately, we live equally. So while disparities in income and education persist among different racial and ethnic communities, by far the starkest disparities pertain to wealth accumulation. And wealth is defined by assets of an individual or household. So for most middle class Americans, the house is the most significant asset they own. And that often when we talk about a racial wealth gap, we're really talking about a home ownership gap. It's really easy to that connection. Now, I just think this particular, statistic is so striking. So this chart right here was taken from a study called Color of Wealth in Boston. That was a joint publication from Duke University, the New School, and the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. So the key findings from the study that I want to share with you, because they're really quite disturbing, but the typical white household in Boston is more likely than non-white households to own every type of liquid asset. So for example, a quarter of US Blacks don't have either a savings or checking account, compared to only 7% of whites. Whites and non-whites also exhibit important differences in assets that are associated with home ownership based on and retirement. Close to 80% of whites own a home, whereas only 1/3 of US Blacks do. And then, although members of communities of color are less likely to own homes, among homeowners, they are more likely to have mortgage debt. Non-white households are also more likely than whites to have student loan and medical debt. But I think if there's one statistic, to take away from this study, which I think is really just like so disturbing and really quite striking. So non-white households have only a fraction of the net worth attributed to white households. So in this survey, while the white households had a median wealth of $207,500, the US Blacks, surveyed in this study, had a median wealth of $8. And you can see that right here in this chart. It's upsetting. And so I think, this is why tonight when we talk about, median wealth, that's why homeowner, plays such a key part of this. And why I think it's so important that we're talking about housing discrimination. So while many of us are aware that disparities exist, and we're deeply concerned with their ongoing impact on communities of color, the history of how we reach this point of segregation and disparity, it's not always easily accessible. And today, that's why we're going to learn about the decisions, policies, and programs time collectively built the inequitable America we have inherited. One where we live apart and our zip code too frequently determines our opportunity. Now, this quote here is taken from The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the book. It's great. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. But I think this quote, really kind of synthesizes his thesis and frames our conversation, our history segment really quite well. So I'd love if someone could read this from the audience. Do we have any takers? Go right ahead. Thanks.
Sure. Our system of official segregation was the result that consigned African Americans to designated neighborhoods. Rather, scores of racially explicit laws, regulations, and government practices combined to create a nationwide system of urban ghettos surrounded by white suburbs. Private discrimination played a role, but it would have been considerably less effective had it not been embraced and reinforced by government.
Thank you so much. So this quote, I think, is really powerful and really hits on the thesis of The Color of Law. In a nutshell, that housing discrimination and the segregation persists today in neighborhoods is a product of de jure policies, sanctioned by the federal government. That's not just facto. So we just covered some ground here. We've seen a lot of really disturbing statistics and studies. So I'd love to, open this up to our first discussion. So think of the role of home ownership in either your own life, your families, historically or now, or your communities. And please define this however is most meaningful to you. What has home ownership meant for you or them? How would your life be different if you or they did not have access to home ownership? And this can include economic, social, emotional, or other impacts.
Well, I'll go. I think that owning a home has actually been very central to my family's life. I mean, I remember when I was young and we lived in Dorchester and we finally moved to our own home in Natick. It was, I just remember how my father was so proud of that little house, that it was his. It was the first time it was his very own home. And I think that I kind of feel that way about my home now, but I think that especially for him, having that home meant being kind of rising up to the middle class, being part of, what America was supposed to offer you after you've done what you're supposed to do and worked hard. So, I think home ownership is central to a lot of us, what we are emotionally.
Thank you so much for sharing that family history. It's so powerful and certainly resonates with me. My family has a very similar story as well. My dad's family's from Chelsea, and they moved to Newton, bought a home there. So yeah, I think, that really encapsulates, so much of, the Jewish experience,
Right.
in Boston. Anyone else want to share?
I will. If you don't own a home and you're looking always to rent, it impacts beyond your own financial standing, but it impacts where your kids go to school, what perhaps what job opportunities are available to you. So it's like a ripple. It's like when you throw a pebble, it has all sorts of ancillary effects on your own ability and your family's ability to to move out of where you are into perhaps another category. I don't know if that's the right word, but to allow you to move up and be a little bit more successful, perhaps, and make some more of your own choices. Like not so much successful, but being able to make choices for yourself and your family.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, where you where you live determines, what public services you have access to. Yeah, that's a really critical point. Anyone else?
I think it's helped given comfort to my father in retirement. There was a cushion with which he was able to fix up his house so that he could stay there longer. He's 96 now, and it went up so much in value, and that isn't true for everyone, but it it was in Newton, and it went from 24,000 when he bought it in 1954 to whatever it is today. I don't know, 900,000, a million, somewhere in there. And but he's been able to use it to help fix it up, to help give him a little money from home equity loan to do what he wanted to. So it gave freedom and comfort.
Thank you so much.
Less stress, not depending on other people. Somebody mentioned renting. You're always dependent on the kindness of others.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we grew up in the suburbs of New York. Grandparents were in Brooklyn, so I thought apartment buildings were where old people and poor people lived. That was my little kid understanding of apartments, because everybody I knew had a house. But like grandma and grandpa, like they didn't need a big place, so they would live in an apartment. And then poor people, right? And then it's so funny that I've been enter now my entire adult life, sometimes in apartment buildings, sometimes in a house like this one. And yeah, you if you have a problem in the house, you have no idea if you roll the dice, you got a good landlord, you're sitting pretty. If you've got a bad landlord, whoo, I've had some bad landlords. Some people know about my experience like lately. The other thing is the equity, right? I mean, my parents bought their house in Rockland County, New York for $28,000 in 1969. And, what is it, 30 times that right now? Which is, how can you even measure this, the security, the economic safety? I mean, it's incalculable.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, that's such an important point. And I think, that's a big transition. Discriminatory mortgage policies. Okay, let me back. Perfect. Okay. So I think a good place to begin is Reconstruction era. And it's interesting. So, Massachusetts was one of the first states to outlaw the enslavement of African American people. 1788, discrimination against African Americans was common throughout the 19th century and the 20th century. Following the end of Reconstruction in 1876, an increasing number of laws and policies were passed that institutionalized discrimination and segregation against formerly enslaved African Americans. These included measures that made it impossible for African Americans to vote, as well as enforced mandated segregation and schools and public accommodation. Boston schools were segregated officially until 1955 and unofficially until the 1970s. And we will talk a little bit more about busing and desegregation of schools later on. Is an important chapter in Boston's history. Massachusetts pioneered the practice also of separate Jim Crow railroad cars in the 1830s. I have these are on the scene of a restored segregated passenger car, similar to those sold by Massachusetts' own Osgood Bradley Company. But, all in all, the function of these laws was to keep African Americans apart from white Americans, both socially, spatially, and to limit their mobility. Okay, I'm sure many of you will recognize this map, the Owners Corporation. You can see in this map here that, the hazardous neighborhoods in Boston are marked in red. The best locations, the best neighborhoods in green, and so on, which was used to determine who received this. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But just so we're all on the same page here, because zoning is the important part of conversation, and even today when we talk about housing discrimination. So just a basic definition. Zoning refers to the system of land regulation cities use to define what kind of building can be built on a plot of land and how it may be used. And the history of zoning has always been a racial history. The first laws that we know of developed between 1910 and 1920 explicitly forbade African Americans from living in particular city districts. Even while this practice was formally outlawed by the Supreme Court in 1917, communities continued to use zoning to create barriers to African American mobility. Okay, so racially restrictive covenants is, I'm sure, as Jews, another topic that we're all familiar with. And this is a tool that was used extensively to segregate neighborhoods and municipalities. So this is just language in a property deed that declared that the property should not be occupied or sold to certain groups of people. And here's an example I have on the screen from a newspaper clipping that appeared in the Washington, D.C. Evening Star in 1920. Soon after the US Supreme Court affirmed the legality of covenants implemented by neighborhood petitions. So restricted covenants as enforceable contracts between two or more private parties until they were struck down by the Supreme Court in a landmark decision in the case of Shelley v. Kramer. In their decision, the court rejected the argument that since states would enforce a restrictive covenant against white people, judicial enforcement of restrictive covenants would not violate the Equal Protection Clause. The court noted that the 14th Amendment guarantees individual rights and that equal protection of the law is not achieved by the imposition of inequalities. So despite the High Court's decision, the use of restrictive covenants continued actually even beyond the 1947 decision. And even though they're no longer, legally enforceable, there's these restricted covenants still exist today. So in 1921, the National Advisory Committee on Zoning, led by Herbert Hoover, published a manual on model zoning law that was distributed and used to shape public policy nationally.
Talia,
Yes.
could you? So I'm not doubting that those covenants still exist, but at some point explain how they can get away with it and how that works when it's illegal. Is it just lack of enforcement from those, or
Bob, it looks like you're about to speak. No, we can absolutely pause now because that's an important point. Bob, it looks like you're about to speak. So if you want to go for it, you're muted. You're still muted.
I know.
Oh, sorry.
No, I'm not. They're enforced. So essentially, they are an artifact that appears in sometimes in people's deeds, but they have no legal meaning or standing. But they still exist. One of the interesting things that's going on right now, and maybe we'll get a chance to talk about this more next week, is that um, they provide a really specific map of racial discrimination, but they're really hard to find if you don't know what you're looking for. And a group of folks in Minneapolis software tool that will basically go through a bunch of digitized property records and identify possible racially restrictive covenants, and then people can read through them and figure out whether they are or not. And I happen to do this in one of their work sessions for Essex County, Massachusetts, and found a number of restrictive covenants that did not allow the property to be sold to Negroes, Jews, Armenians, Italians, Arabs. So the,
It'll, I'm sorry to interrupt, Bob. So it'll just straight up say that. I mean, I think we should be clear. It'll just straight up say that in the deed, or, you know, this property shall never be sold to
yes,
a black person, an Arab, a Jew.
it will straight up say that. That's right. But they're not enforceable. They haven't been enforceable since 1947.
But do you ever get it? And I- I'm sorry, Talia. I'm just so interested
No, it
in
is.
this,
It's an important.
how this works today. So, like a real estate agent who will say, I know it's not legal, but is that how it works? Is that
No, they
No.
really don't. I mean, real estate agents will do other things that discriminate, but they don't advertise or rely on racially restrictive covenants. What they do is they do what's called racial steering. They essentially gaslight buyers of color and don't return their calls. That's the kind of thing that happens. Racially restrictive covenants are not part of the practice of even the worst real estate agents.
Okay, thank you, Bob, for that clarification. Yes.
Yeah, I
Kara.
want to say that you don't always need a covenant. And this is, I'm gonna relay an incident that happened in Acton about 5 years ago. It was this Black African Muslim man went to buy a condo in Acton and met a man I know or knew at the time. And as he was inspecting the place, a neighbor came out and said, we didn't used to allow people like you in this, our condo association agreement, you didn't used to allow people like you in there. That was enough to dissuade him from living in Acton. So just
Awful.
whether it was true or not, that there was something in the condo agreement, it was enough to make him decide to live elsewhere.
Thank you for sharing that. That's, that's horrific. So I guess to continue on, I think that actually was an important tangent. So thank you for stopping me so we could clarify that point, because it is quite disturbing. But we're talking about the National Advisory Committee on Zoning in 1921, led by Herbert Hoover, published a manual on model zoning law that was distributed and used to shape policy nationally. And the committee was dominated by active segregationists whose vision for America was segregated and stratified along racial and ethnic lines. So for example, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., famous architect, landscaper, designed the World Fair in Chicago and Central Park in New York City, Forest Park in Springfield, where I am. So he wrote in quote, in any housing developments which are to succeed, racial divisions have to be taken into account. If you try to force the mingling of people who are not ready to mingle and don't want to mingle, a development cannot succeed economically. So there you have it, pretty overt. Now we have a quote here from Professor Ernest Fromm. Do you have any takers to read this quote?
I'll-
Awesome. So much, Sue.
The colored people into a district was a more powerful reason for the spread of zoning in the past decade than the creation of single-family districts, stated justification for zoning.
Okay. So there you have it. This is was at the time the preeminent professor on this subject. I think it's a pretty powerful quote. So as it suggests, zoning laws, particularly around multifamily homes, have always been racialized, and historically been designed to segregation. And I think this is really interesting because it is, such a hot topic today and comes up so often in, town meetings and about zoning. So in 1926, there was a Supreme Court decision that declared multifamily housing was, quote, a nuisance in single family neighborhoods. And the lower court judge in this case explained that, quote, the blighting of property values and the congesting of the population whenever colored or in foreign races invade a residential section are so well known as to be within judicial cognizance. This is what the judge wrote. So this is an example of how a law can have a racialized impact without being explicitly racialized. And when we hear conversation today about multifamily housing, I think those sort of resonances are still very much there. So throughout the 20th century, zoning regulations constantly industrial use development in neighborhoods of color, especially African American communities. Neighborhoods that permitted multifamily housing were drawn closer to industrial use, which often introduced unregulated materials toxic to air, water, and soil of surrounding communities. Primarily, African American communities were disproportionately zoned to permit uses such as manufacturing and hazard waste sites, which continues to impact community health and property values today. And I think this is why you have, a lot of low-income communities of color, disproportionately represented, next to Superfund sites. Where I live, in Springfield, we have one of the highest asthma in the country. And this all goes back to particulate matter in these industrial sites that were zoned into these neighborhoods. Okay, our second breakout room of the night. So when you think of a healthy and safe community, what comes to mind? What does a community need to be healthy and safe physically, socially, and economically? Think of a community you associate with health and safety. This can be your own. I know many of you live in Acton. And how does its buildings, institutions, geography, and public spaces contribute to that? And finally, think of a community you associate as being unhealthy or unsafe, and what makes it so, and how did these same factors influence that? So there's a lot to discuss here. I'm sure we could have an hour-long conversation just about this, but I'd love to hear, your initial observations and thoughts. And take your time too. I don't want to rush you. If you want some time also to think through these questions, that's totally fine.
Well, I think for a community to be healthy and safe needs economic opportunity, educational opportunity, and I wonder, I to tell you the truth, I'm so stuck on a judge talking about Blacks, African Americans invading, actually using the word invade, that I can barely stand it. But I think that a community, but I do think that, that our communities, we think of Acton as a safe community. We don't worry about the safety now of our water, of our air, and we think of unhealthy communities as being, in the city where people have to, breathe in air that's unhealthy, and this creates a lot of health inequity also. There are just so many things.
Those are all great. I think everything you mentioned, just in terms of environmental racism, access to clean water and clean air, all of that, is so important.
I think of open space, green space, walkability, and people employed all contribute to my feeling of community is
Yeah.
safe.
Thank you so much, Franny. Yeah, I completely agree.
I think
Also-
low crime level is significant.
Yeah, the feeling of safety. Yeah, absolutely.
I was going to add that I think of a community that has representatives in town government that genuinely care about the environment and safety, and base their knowledge base it on scientific knowledge, and work hard to make the community healthy and safe. We're just, I think living in Acton, we are fortunate to have people in our town government that are concerned. And we recently received a letter through the mail mentioning something about our water levels, and that we need to be aware of what's going on with that. And I'm not sure how they're addressing it right now, but keeping us informed of possible concerns.
Thank you so much, Doris. That's excellent. Yeah, we need representation. Absolutely. Yeah, feeling, a sense of affinity with your elected officials, accounting as well. That's all great.
And that it's not hidden like in Michigan.
Yes. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. Transparency too.
I think there's a racial component that I have never lived in a majority Black community. I've lived in communities that are fairly mixed, like when I lived in Cambridge, but I don't know how I would feel in terms of safety. And especially with certain cultural differences and young men who are into whatever, I just quite honestly don't know how I would feel and how much of a factor that would be. But clearly, it's a significant factor for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think access, to social services is important, and there is a lot of disinvestment, as we've seen a trend, disinvestment in social services in urban areas. And I think it is, there is a trend there, related to like property taxes, why people feel like they have more access to social services living in the suburbs, or like ring neighborhoods, the Boston metro area. I think that's certainly part of it.
I think when Michael said about being, I interpreted it as thinking about what it's like to be a minority in terms of feeling safe in your community. When I moved out to Acton, it was a question in my mind: are there other Jews out there? Because it somehow felt safer when there were people that shared a certain identity with me. And so I'm thinking about how it is, what makes a place feel safe. It might not be safe, like you can look at it and say, that's a safe neighborhood from afar. But for certain people, certain neighborhoods would feel safe because they feel like they have camaraderie.
Yeah, no, thank you for clarifying that.
I don't know if that's what you meant, Michael, but to me, I interpret it that way.
I also think that what we think of as a community may not feel like a safe community to another group of people. A safe, I mean, these suburbs are always seen as very safe, and wouldn't everybody like to live out here? But if you're, the only Black family on your street, I'm not sure that always feels safe.
Yeah.
I was going to say that a community, I mean, is a town a community? Is if you've got a white part of a town and a Black part of a town, which might or might not be the wealthier part of the town, and the part of the town with fewer services, I mean, is that one community? I think that's, if some people are protected, some people feel safe in the schools. I mean, to get down to brass tacks here in Acton and Boxborough, is that a safe or an unsafe community? It kind of depends who you are.
Yeah. No, that's a fair point. And I think, as you've all said, you can interpret community in so many different ways. And I think, feeling, a sense of camaraderie, connection to your neighbors. That's also an important part of the sense of safety and belonging. So, thank you for bringing that up. And again, I'm sorry, Michael, if I misinterpreted your initial comment. But that's also.
I don't think you misinterpreted it.
Okay. Okay,
I didn't mean that you necessarily misinterpreted it, but
no,
that's
absolutely. I'm glad you. Yes, no, I'm glad that you mentioned that.
Yeah, Franny's point was part of what I was saying, and I mean, even if you're in a community that's majority like you, it doesn't mean that you feel safe. Some neighborhoods where you get people getting shot every few days probably doesn't feel safe, even if you're in the majority.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, absolutely. Okay. I will continue. Well, by the way, sharing your thoughts here. I really appreciate your participation. So moving on, we have the term redlining, which refer to federal housing policies that mandated segregation as a condition to gain access to programs and benefits designed to expand access to housing, effectively ensuring that segregation and discrimination became a national housing policy. The origins of redlining can be found in President FDR's landmark New Deal legislation in 1933, which remains one of the most influential measures on American housing policy to date. In order to secure the approval of segregation Democrats, the New Deal restricted its opportunities based upon race, at times segregating communities that had once been integrated.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And if you're interested in this topic as well, there are lots of exam sessions that FDR made in the New Deal to get it passed that ultimately, it kind of created more discrimination today, even in terms of, labor rights as well. So it's fascinating, and I encourage you all to do research. It's really very interesting. So the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation, so HOLC, and the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, were created to ensure mortgages and help rebuild the housing market in the wake of the 1929 crash, which just devastated the housing market. These agencies created underwriting guidelines that banks had to follow in order for federal agencies to insure their mortgages. And the underwriting guidelines required that neighborhoods be racially homogeneous and white. So think back to the HOLC map that we saw at the beginning, the red neighborhoods and the green neighborhoods. Yeah, which neighborhoods were going to be underwritten. Here is a quote from the Federal Housing Administration Underwriting Manual in 1935. Love to have someone read it.
If a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes.
Thank you
Wow.
so much. So there you
Wow.
have it. Yeah. So this redlining was also present, with the Veteran Day. And following World War II, the VA played a pivotal role in expanding American homeownership through both individual homes and the development of large community, Levittown, you can see in this picture. And these programs were critical in expanding the American middle class and serve as the foundation of so many American family stories. But the VA also perpetuated the same racial exclusions that the HOLC and the FJ originally instituted, ensuring that African Americans were systematically excluded from these opportunities. In fact, through communities like Levittown, the VA actively the development of new segregated communities. This is my last slide before we move on and talk a little bit about Acton. But I thought that this is, an important Boston history to talk about, just because these pictures are truly, really quite disturbing. And I think, speak to some of the problems that, plague the city of Boston. And today, of the FHA and the HOLC's decisions and this de jure segregation. So in response to decades of racial segregation in 1974, the US District Court for the District of Massachusetts required the Boston Public Schools to integrate the schools through busing. I'm younger, but I'm sure, for many of you remember this, it's really quite recent. And court-mandated busing, which continued until 1988, provoked enormous outrage among many white Bostonians and helped to catalyze racist violence and class tensions across the city throughout the 1970s and 1980s. And, at this point, it's become really this national iconography of these anti-busing protests in the news. And it's really, kind of cemented Boston's reputation as a city just plagued by racial and socioeconomic strife. As we talked about before, this segregation was reinforced by the Boston School Committee districting decisions and stark residential segregation. And schools in African American neighborhoods were badly underfunded, under-equipped, understaffed, eliciting protests from enrolled students and their parents. And schools that serve Black children received about 2/3 of the amount of funding received by schools in white neighborhoods. So I think these pictures, are important to see. And I'm sure, many of you have seen these images before because they're quite famous. But I'm going to now hand it over to Bob, our expert here, to talk a little bit more about discrimination and some of that history.
Thanks, Talia. So I wanted to talk not just about Discrimination Act and about history and how it kind of connects to this story. Acton does not have a redlining map because Acton was essentially a rural community until the period between 1950 and 1960. So, but it's important to note that that does not mean that racial prejudice and racism were absent from the community. It was not a rural paradise. I had a long conversation recently with Bill Clower, who some would do as the historian, and he told me that the Ku Klux Klan was active in Acton in the 20s and 30s. It was active in Massachusetts, and in fact, in October 1924, the KKK held a rally in Worcester that drew 15,000 people to such gathering in New England. The chapter that Acton folks were active in was called the Nashua River branch of the Klan. And Bill told me a story that the Klan members active in Acton were most concerned about Irish Catholics moving into Acton. And Daniel Sweeney, who later became the big developer that kind of led the way for the suburbanization of Acton, moved to Acton in 1935, and he was the patriarch of a large Irish Catholic family, and there was a cross burned on in their yard, according to Bill's story, very shortly after they moved in. So the fact that the Klan was active, I think, is an indication of kind of the overall tone uh, of civic life in New England. It was just because we didn't have explicit Jim Crow laws in most cases. We did have, there was Klan activity, and I think African Americans probably felt pretty reluctant to move some small communities in Massachusetts. As we move beyond the 30s into the 50s, the construction of Route 128 was a truly important step for Acton and for the entire Boston region. And the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination wrote a report in 1975 entitled Route 128, Boston's Road to Segregation, which described how many of these along 128 moved to eliminate or zoning for multifamily housing as Route 128 was being built, because that had on opportunities for African Americans who therefore couldn't find housing opportunities, affordable, small a, in proximity to new job opportunities in Lexington or Waltham or along 28. Acton, with this growth, adopted its first zoning code in 1953. Its zoning code in 1953 relatively permissive in terms of multifamily housing, and the result of that was that a lot of multifamily housing was built in Acton in the 1960s. Most of the apartment buildings, many of which are condominiums now, along 2A were built in the 1960s or in the 1970s. The result of that multifamily construction was there was a reaction against multifamily housing, and the zoning code underwent a revision in the 1970s. It virtually ended the construction of new multifamily housing, except for what we see as of in 40B developments that override local zoning. So Acton, they may not have been explicit about the reason for excluding multifamily housing, but the same thing happened here in Acton in the 1970s as happened in other places in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. So many of you probably know this story, but Acton had 3,500 residents in 1950. It doubled its population between 1950 and 1960. It doubled again between 1960 and 1970. With the end of multifamily apartment development, growth slowed tremendously in the 70s, and virtually didn't at all in the 1980s. Up the up until 2000, Acton's population was very, very white. In 1990, Acton was 93.6% white. In 2000, it was about 88% white. Since then, as folks know, there has been a significant increase in the non-white population, although most of those folks have been Asian Americans, both East Asian and South Asian Americans. Still relatively few African Americans of whatever ethnic origin have been able to live in Acton. A few facts about Acton's actions in the past, which have gone against more inclusion or diversity. This is again from conversation with Bill Clower, and I'm still hoping to track down documentation on this, but people with the MECO program, which is a school integration program, which serves thousands of young people of color who voluntarily bused to suburban schools. And some Acton apparently considered joining METCO in the late 1960s or early 1970s. The METCO program began in 1966 and decided not to do so. It really wasn't a question of being too far from Boston. Concord is part of METCO, Sudbury is part of METCO, Foxborough is part of METCO, which is equally far from Boston. We could have participated in METCO, but we didn't. And I'm hoping to find out more in coming days about decision. Another decision which the town made, which I think shows that we have not been inclusive in the past, was the decision to basically not regionalize our public schools with the town of Maynard. That happened in the late 1980s. There was kind of a grand bargain that was proposed where Acton would get access to Maynard sewer, and Maynard would get access to Acton school system. The town leadership presented that proposal at town meeting in the late 1980s, but the community voted it down. Bill described hearing comments from people, our SAT scores will go down, and essentially it was a class bias decision against the community of Maynard. And we could have had a larger and better resource school system, but we decided not to do that. A couple of facts about home ownership costs now in Acton and who's getting access to those units, to market rate home ownership units. In the latest data that was available was for 2017. There were 396 families that applied for and received mortgage loans to purchase homes in Acton. Of those 396 families, 198 were white, 142 were Asian, 10 were Latino, and only 1 was African American. This data is from the Mass Community Banking Council in their annual report on changing patterns of mortgage lending. In 2017, the average price of a home in Acton was $608,000, and a household needed an income of at least $140,000 annually to afford that. So one other fact, which I think is kind of an indication of our community values that I hope we can move to change. Acton has a total of 11,827 acres of land. Single family homes are an as of right use on 9,078 acres, or 76.7% of Acton's land area. Only 402 acres allow multifamily housing to be built as of right. You can contrast that to the fact that Acton has more than 1,600 acres of protected open space. So we have put a high value on protected open space, one could say 4 times higher than the value we place on having multifamily housing. So I'm going to stop there, and I know that we'll have more time next week to talk about the thing we're doing in Acton, and some of the ways that folks from your congregation are already participating and more that we can consider doing in the future. So thanks for allowing me to be part of this conversation.
Thank you much for adding that. Found that fascinating. So just to look forward to next time before we wrap up. So next Tuesday, we'll be talking a little bit more about, what the legacy of housing discrimination. Yes, Sarah, go for it.
Next Wednesday.
Oh, my bad. Then we are scheduled for next Wednesday. I misspoke. Yes. Thank you for clarifying. That is important. Yeah. Wednesday, we'll be talking about the legacy of housing discrimination today. And more importantly, what organizing looks like. What do we do to take action locally in our communities? So before we go, and I think we probably will have time for a couple of questions, but before I forget, this is the first time that we've actually presented the housing module in full, and we would love your feedback. It's so helpful for as take this presentation elsewhere and bring this to other communities and congregations like yours. So I am going to momentarily post a link to a feedback form in the chat. Let's see, and I know it's always okay, and I know it's always it's hard to save the chat feature. So if you're able to, open up the form now, just so you save that and you're able to, at your convenience, fill that out. We'd love to hear from you. But that's it in terms of the presentation. I guess I'll open it up to questions. We have about 5 minutes, I think, before we're scheduled to end. I know we're lucky to have Bob with us tonight. So if anyone has any questions or would want to hear about anything, more in depth,